Hey, folks, today is Friday, October 12th, 2018. This is Roland Martin Unfiltered. I'm broadcasting live from Bloomington, Illinois, where I'm speaking to the NAACP chapter's Freedom Fund dinner in about an hour. Our focus, though, right now is on Georgia, where one of the most shameless and vulgar displays of voter suppression is going on in that state. Stacey Abrams, the Democratic candidate, is running against Brian Kemp, the Republican candidate and the current Secretary of State. In Georgia, the Secretary of State controls the voter rolls, and Kemp has been doing everything he can to keep potential Abrams supporters from voting. A new poll out this morning from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution has Kemp and Abrams locked in a very tight race. Kemp is at 47.7% to Abrams 46.3%. That is well within the margin of error and is insignificant when you look at the stats. Now, in effect, they are tied, which is why of 53,000 voters whose registrations are currently pending, 70% of which are African Americans, is so important. The Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law and the Georgia NAACP have both filed lawsuits to stop this latest attempt to steal the election by Republicans in Georgia. Now, 53,000 people whose registrations are pending failed the exact match test, where missing just an apostrophe in your name, for example, will disqualify you from registering. Stacey Abrams joins us right now live from Georgia. Stacey, glad to have you here. You serve in the state legislature, and what I'm trying to understand is why folks have not asked Brian Kemp to recuse himself, but so to have the person who is Secretary of State making these decisions when he is the gubernatorial candidate, that to me sounds unfair.
I agree. It is very concerning to me. And in fact, our Constitution in Georgia does permit the Secretary of State to continue in that job until the end of his term. But in previous years, Democratic and Republican Secretaries of State have looked at this very closely. Secretary of State Karen Handel stepped down from her job. Secretary of State Kathy Cox considered it, but she didn't win the primary. Max Cleland stepped down. And so we know that prior Secretaries of State of both parties raised grave concerns about overseeing your own election to the highest job. Unfortunately, Brian Kemp does not care. Even as the Democratic leader in the House, I stepped down from my job in the legislature because I wanted there to be no appearance of impropriety. And I'm deeply dismayed that he would put his own ambitions ahead of the integrity of our election process. But here's the thing. It's up to him to decide. There is no legislative imprimatur that can make him leave. It's up to his conscience and his goodwill. And I think we see from his behavior that he does not believe it's necessary to step down.
Well, what is stunning to me is when you begin to look at what's going on here, to say that, well, if you don't put your middle initial or you don't have an apostrophe or a period, they're going to kick those registrations out. That to me is just utterly shameful.
So the exact match system has been in place for years. And if you recall, because you were such a big proponent of ours during this process, when the New Georgia Project filed thousands of registrations in 2014, we raised the alarm that 40,000 were not being processed. 18,000 were processed after the election, but that still left entirely too many unaccounted for. And we started talking to other organizations. We realized that because of how many registrations we'd submitted, that there was something very fishy going on. It took us 3 years in court, but in 2017, we got a court order by a federal court that forced Brian Kemp to admit that he had illegally canceled 33,000 plus registrations for exact match. And the court made him restore every single one and make them voters. And in response to that victory, in response to Brian Kemp admitting he was wrong, the Republican legislature passed a law making it legal for him to do it again. And so we weren't surprised by the number that was released this week because of the AP, because of the Associated Press's investigation. We didn't start this. The Associated Press did this on their own. But we weren't surprised because he's been planning this. He's been working at this, and he does not respect the right to vote for every American.
And again, what we are seeing, this is not just in Georgia. We saw the Missouri Secretary of State, a Republican, actually run commercials telling people they had to use their vote, have a identification to vote a federal judge came out and said, not the case. We've seen what is taking place in multiple states, and this is state after state after state, where Republicans continue to try to shade the numbers off. And the Republican National Committee, Chairman McDaniel says nothing. Donald Trump says nothing. And significant numbers of Black Republicans say nothing. This is flat out policy of the Republican National Committee across this nation to suppress the vote, to keep people, especially African Americans, from voting.
Well, I would point out that also in North Dakota, they've passed a law that in the Supreme Court, with Kavanaugh as the deciding vote, upheld a law that's going to force Native Americans, who've already been stripped of so many rights and so many opportunities. This will disenfranchise thousands of Native Americans because they have a close Senate election there. I, as a daughter of two civil rights activists who fought for the right to vote before they were old enough to vote themselves, I was raised to revere the right to vote. But I was also raised that you fight for that right. And what I want people to understand is we are going to fight for the 53,000 who have not been granted full processing of their application. But I want them to know two things. One, if you're one of the 53,000, show up anyway. Do not let him scare you out of voting. But number two, we have 1.9 million eligible Democratic-leaning voters in the state of Georgia who didn't vote in the last midterm election. If even a fraction of them turn out, especially to vote for the 53,000, we will win this election. That's why they're so terrified. Ayanna Pressley was down here a couple of days ago, and she talked about her election, how she was down 13 the day of the election, but won by 17 points, became the first person of color to go to the House of Representatives from Massachusetts. And what she said is, look, when they do polls, they are polling likely voters. We've got to poll unlikely voters. We've got to turn out unlikely voters. Because what she said is this: you cannot poll transformation. And what we're doing in this election here, down in Florida, up in Maryland, across this country, is transforming the electorate. And we cannot let Republican voter suppression tactics block our way.
Last question for you. I know you have to go. Obviously, lawsuits are being filed. What are you telling people they should be doing? Let's just say that this is potentially their name. First of all, how do they even check to know? I mean, is the Secretary of State, is he notifying people that he's holding their registration, or is there any way for them to even know this?
So part of the challenge with the Secretary of State's office that we identified in 14 is that they have a very haphazard delivery system of information. It's often left to each county or to the Secretary of State, and it can differ. And so we don't know if people know. What we do know is this: if they go to the Secretary of State's website, they can put in their information on the My Voter page and see if their name comes up. If it does not, I encourage them to call the Secretary of State's office and ask about their application. But here's what the Secretary of State has said publicly. He has said if people are on that list, if they're worried about whether they can vote, they need to come to the polling places, bring their IDs, and they should be allowed to vote if they can substantially prove that they are who they say they are. I think that's an entirely unnecessary hurdle because of someone else's mistake, but we'll keep fighting that fight. No one should stay home because they're afraid, because that's how voter suppression works. It's not just about stopping you from registering. It's about scaring you out of using your power. And so everyone who is registered should show up at the polls, make them send you home. Do not stay home on your own.
All right, then. Stacey Abrams, we certainly appreciate it. Thank you so very much. We're going to be keeping the focus on this every single day until the election, because I don't care how anybody votes, whether they want to vote for you or vote for Brian Kemp. At the end of the day, it is wrong to suppress the vote. We should be making it easier for folks to vote and not making it harder. Thanks for joining us at Roland Martin Unfiltered.
Thank you so much.
All right, folks, let's talk about that lawsuit being filed by the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law. Again, they're alleging that Georgia's no vote policy has held up more than 53,000 voter registration applications, that it is disenfranchising those voters. And as we told you, 70% of that 53,000 African American. Joining us right now is Danielle Lang, Senior Legal Counsel for Voting Rights and Redistricting for the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law. Danielle, so explain us exactly what is going on here. What is the legal challenge you're filing? How do you hope to be successful in court? And did you file it in state court or federal court?
Great question. I just want to make one clarification because I don't want to overclaim. I work at Campaign Legal Center, which is a partner of Lawyers Committee in this lawsuit representing the various civil rights groups that have sued. They've sued in federal court, and what they've alleged is very similar to what Ms. Abrams explained. The plaintiffs have alleged, just as the AP report demonstrated, that this exact match policy adds nothing to the security of elections in Georgia, nothing whatsoever, because in order to quote unquote fix this problem, you show ID that you would be required to show at the polls anyhow, and yet it's fast tracking these voters for potential purges, a use it or lose it right, that it disproportionately impacts minority voters. Not only does it disproportionately impact minority voters, but the legislature and Secretary Kemp knew that it would disproportionately impact minority voters when they passed this law in 2017 because of our lawsuit in 2016, where we won a settlement alleging the disproportionate impact of this policy, and then they turned around and passed it into law in 2017. So it has a disproportionate impact that is demonstrable and that the legislature knew about. So we've alleged that this violates the National Voter Registration Act, which says that every completed voter registration application needs to be registered, fully registered to vote, violates the Voting Rights Act because of its discriminatory impact, and it violates the Constitution because it puts up entirely unnecessary barriers to the right to vote. But I do want to repeat what Ms. Abrams said earlier, which is that voters on this list do have the right to vote, and they should not be scared away from using it. If they show up in person and show the necessary photo ID under the Georgia voter ID law, they will be eligible to vote a regular ballot. There's been a lot of misinformation out there about having to vote a provisional ballot. You can vote a regular ballot if you show your photo ID, and that's really important because voters might have to advocate for themselves if poll officials do not, understand or are necessarily well trained on these rules. So it's really important that voters show up in person if they're on this list and show their photo ID. For this upcoming election, what I'm most worried about is how this might affect vote by mail. We've seen a surge in this election of applications for vote by mail in Georgia, particularly among black voters, and there's no guarantee that those votes will be counted. So I would encourage anyone who's on this list to vote in person with their photo ID, and while Lawyers Committee and Campaign Legal Center and the groups on the ground fight in court to resolve these problems of vote by mail and other pressing issues for this upcoming election.
So, Danielle, how do we know, though? How does a person know if they're on the list? I mean, is it on a website? Because you're saying that if you're on this list, go vote in person. How do you know?
That's a great question. As Ms. Abrams said, you can go on the Georgia My Voter page online, put in your information, and what should show up, if the system is working correctly, is that you should show up as being registered, but with a kind of asterisk on the top that says, your application is impending and you need to contact your registrar. So if you see that notification, you'll know that you're on the list. Likewise, if you for some reason don't show up at all, that's reason for concern and reason to call your local registrar and make sure that you are on the list, either on the pending list or the regular list, and will be able to vote a regular ballot.
Last question for you, Danielle. Are we seeing any other dastardly acts by Republicans in other states when it comes to messing with folks when it comes to voting?
We're always fighting a wave of voter suppression year in, year out, and that's especially true in tight elections, and this election is no exception. I'm sure that many of your viewers have seen recent reports about issues in Prairie View A&M's campus in Waller County. Waller County has a very long history of discrimination against black voters and the voters on the A&M campus. They are now having some sort of issue where the county told them to register to a certain address, but that was actually the wrong address, and now they have to change their voter registration in order to be able to vote in the right precinct. We see continuous, really large purge numbers as a result of the Supreme Court's decision earlier this year in an Ohio case, allowing states to essentially implement a use it or lose it policy where if you don't vote for a few years, you're just removed from the rolls. That appears to be what's happening in Georgia along with this 53,000, which is why so many people have been purged from the rolls in Georgia in the past few years under Secretary Kemp's administration.
And I want to deal with this Prairie View issue because you're absolutely right. Look, I'm wearing my Texas A&M shirt because we're playing South Carolina tomorrow, and the reality is Prairie View is under the Texas A&M University system. It's only about 90 miles from Houston, and Waller County. They have been doing these games. Lawsuits go back decades because they know full well that the black students at Prairie View could very well determine who elected officials are in Waller County. And so they have been doing this constantly, trying to keep those black students from impacting politics in Waller County.
Yes, one of my first jobs when I joined the Campaign Legal Center in 2015 was writing a letter to Waller County when they tried to remove all the early voting locations from the Prairie View A&M campus. That thankfully was reversed as a result of advocacy from us and others. But this is a long-term problem in Waller County for the students, and they are currently struggling to find a resolution that will ensure that all of those students who properly registered and followed the county's directions will be permitted to vote on Election Day. So we're following that very closely.
All right, Danielle Lang, we certainly appreciate it. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much.
All right, folks, and again, to check whether you're successfully registered to vote, we want you to visit www.mvp.sos.ga.gov. Again, it's right there on the screen, www.mvp.sos.ga.gov. If your registration is on hold, you're told to notify the county election office to verify your information. Even if you are pending, you can still vote. As we've said, you just heard, if you have a Georgia driver's license or a state-issued photo ID when you go to vote, look, you took the time to register. Make sure Brian Kemp does not steal your vote. And for Georgians in Randolph and Grady counties, 2 counties hit hard by Hurricane Michael, your voter registration deadline has been extended until at least October 15th, okay? Speaking of registering to vote, we'll be doing the deadlines every day until Election Day. Here are the deadlines for the next 5 days. October 13th, if you live in Delaware, that is your deadline to vote in Delaware. October 15th, Virginia. October 16th, Kansas, Maryland, New Jersey, Oregon, and West Virginia. If you live in Massachusetts and South Carolina, your deadline to register is October 17th, and October 18th, your deadline. If you live in Nevada, that is your deadline. Joining us right now on our panels, activist and educator Brittany Packnett, Brandon Cooper, chairman of the Prince George's County Republican Party, and Ray Baker, a host of Public Agenda podcast. I'm going to throw it out to the panel. Anybody can jump in first. Bottom line is this here. I have been saying this for months and for months and for years. It is by design for Republicans to keep doing what they're doing to suppress the vote, to shave off voters here. It makes no sense. We saw what Chris Kobach in Kansas was doing with Crosscheck, where they were eliminating people in Michigan because they say a same name person was registered in another state, knowing full well it's 2 different people. And I don't understand why national Republicans are not calling out their own party for what they're doing. It is despicable. We have to deal with this every election.
Well, you know, Roland, this happens, to your point, every single election. Before I answer that, though, I want to point out that Waller County, Texas, is also the place where Sandra Bland died. And so we know that there are continuous patterns and practices of disenfranchisement, of abuse, and of oppression all across the South and all across this nation. But especially when we look at places like Texas and Georgia and Florida, it is high time for our voices to finally be heard. So when I saw what was happening in Georgia, when so many of us saw what was happening in Georgia, we sounded the alarm. We wanted to make sure that people knew what their rights were. And I'm so thankful that you're talking about this. But I actually want to look at what voter suppression is looking like in Florida, because to your point, this is happening all over the country. And there's a difference between voter suppression and voter disenfranchisement. Voter suppression are all of these these covert ways in which barriers and obstacles are created. So people are purged from voter rolls, they're given misleading information, they're told that they're registered, and then they show up and they find out that they aren't. All of the kinds of things we've been talking about thus far. Voter disenfranchisement is when the law actually denies you from being able to vote. At 1.4 million Floridians and 5.3 million people across this country are disenfranchised from their right to vote simply because they are formerly convicted felons. They've served their debt to society, and when they come back and return to society, they still are not allowed to engage as full citizens. The online voter registration form in Florida was mysteriously acting up on the final day of voter registration in Florida. So we know that in places like Florida and all across the country, if the vote is continuously suppressed, not only will we see the kinds of candidates that we don't want to have elected be elected, we'll also see the very people who need those voters to show up to restore voting rights to this disenfranchised continue to be denied.
Brandon, I'm still look. You know me, Brandon. I've been asking for this for the longest, and I still don't understand why a group of black Republicans have not come together as a group to call out the party's constant voter suppression. I told you what's happening in Georgia. In Missouri, a federal judge had to slap down the Missouri Secretary of State who put out a lying ad telling people they had to bring their ID to vote. They didn't. He was lying. And so I just don't understand that Republicans keep doing this and black Republicans don't say nothing as a group.
Yeah, you're right, Roland. We talk about this often. I want to make sure it's very clear, as my colleague was talking about earlier. The right to vote is sacred, and I don't want to make it sure it's very clear that I do not support any attempt to disenfranchise or suppress the vote. But going back to the topic that we talked about all day, which is going on in Georgia, I think we need to take a step back, and I understand that there's an election coming up, and I think a large part of this narrative is an effort, political games, to kind of gin up turnout vote. If you look at what's happened over Georgia over the last since 2006, registration votes for African Americans up 44%. Registration votes for Hispanics up 67%. Up for whites is only 12%. This year, there's a record number of voters registered in Georgia that broke all-time records. They have now, you can register online by going on the website 24 hours a day up until a deadline, which was just passed, to register to vote. So this idea that Republican Kemp or the previous Secretary of State in Georgia is somehow trying to stop blacks and minorities from registering to vote is clearly disproven by the facts that we have record increases in voter registration of blacks and Hispanics over the last couple of years. Going forward to what's going on right now, you're asking about the exact match, which again, I'm not a particular fan of. I work here in Maryland politics. They have a similar program here, and that's controlled by Democrats here in Maryland, where that if your address is messed up or your social security number is messed up, you're purged from, you're placed in a temporary holding position. And so I know you focus.
No, one second, Brandon. Brandon,
yes, sir.
You just said,
yeah,
Brandon, this is what you just said.
Yep.
You just said that if your address or your social security number is messed up, that's not what they're doing in Georgia. In Georgia, they are literally saying if a period or an apostrophe, or even if, okay, so if I did Roland Martin, and there's another document that says Roland S. Martin, their deal is, we're taking that out.
I'm familiar with that. Now,
that's totally different. Now, an address and a social security number, that's different than an apostrophe or a period, bruh.
Let me correct you where you're wrong, Roland. The 53,000 votes that are currently on hold, some of those are because the addresses are different, some of those because Social Security, and yes, to your point, some of those are also because the name is different. And I agree with you, that is horribly wrong. I was talking to a Democrat in my county just last week. There's a similar policy here in Maryland when you're trying to petition to get on the ballot. If your name is different, if their apostrophe or hyphen is different, they will not count your name as far as petition. Now, that's a little bit different. It's not voter registration, but back to your point about going in Georgia, some of those 53,000 are social security numbers and addresses. All those are not the hyphen. So I agree with you. That's horrible and it's wrong. Let me say one more last thing before you go.
But the problem in Georgia, here's my problem in Georgia. You have a Secretary of State who's been slapped down, who it was wrong what he did. And it's like, okay, we're going to go back and we're going to continue to do it. And so this is a pattern. This isn't, hey, we made a mistake one time. This is a deliberate attempt by Brian Kemp to keep folks from voting.
Let me just go end with this right quick, Roland. Keep saying that it's Brian Kemp, and you know it's factual. I like to talk about facts. The 53,000 votes in Georgia, not a single one of them were flagged by Brian Kemp. They were flagged by the County Board of Elections, including some hundreds of them from Fulton County, which you know is a black majority and Democrat-controlled county. It is the local boards of elections that are flagging them in accordance with the state law that was passed by a Republican legislator. But I'll make it very clear also,
Okay, hold on.
I agree with Stacey when she says that Kemp needs to. I agree the Republicans did, but I agree with Stacey that Brian Kemp should resign.
Don't try to run past that.
No, I'm not trying to run past that.
It's not just the state Republicans,
Let me go back.
right? It is the Secretary of State. In every single state, the Secretary of State is in control of elections. The local boards of elections are not going to do that which the Secretary of State has not pushed them to do. So to act as though those two things are completely disconnected is fallacious.
So
and on top of that, what you also said was that because registrations are high, somehow Brian Kemp must not actually be deliberately going out there and trying to stop the African American vote. Black people have been triumphant over things that have been pushed on us for centuries. So the idea that we somehow made it through doesn't negate the fact that Brian Kemp is doing exactly what we're saying he's doing.
Ray Baker, thank you. I was going to bring that point up. Because black people, we say, fine, you got a hurdle, we gonna jump over the hurdle. Oh, the hurdle was 2 feet, we jumped over it. Oh, you raised it to 4 feet? All right, we gonna go back and practice, and we gonna come back and jump 4 feet. Oh, now you wanna move it to 8 feet. We gonna go back and practice and jump over 8 feet. But the point, Brandon, that I want Ray to speak to is you keep putting damn hurdles up.
Absolutely. Real quick, Roland. Absolutely. Real quick, Roland. Brandon, the song is called We Shall Overcome, right? That means that when people try to do things that stop us, we are able to successfully overcome those things and push forward for our full rights of humanity and citizenship. On another point of this question, you say it as though Brian Kemp is elevating the voter registration rolls for African Americans. He is not. As Brittany so clearly laid out, we are doing so despite him, not because of him. Finally, we have to ask this question. How come time and time again, when we see voter suppression laws that will overwhelmingly and undoubtedly affect African Americans, it happens to be Republicans? Lastly, Mr. Kemp would not even recuse himself. Chris Kobach of President Trump's fraudulent and erroneous voter integrity panel, I believe they were calling it, even begrudgingly agreed to recuse himself. If Chris Kobach will recuse himself, what makes Brian Kemp so good not to recuse himself? There's so many questions that almost come down to make this almost personal, because Ms. Abrams was in charge of a voter registration activity when she was the leader of the House Minority Caucus in Georgia that was specifically focused on increasing the number of young and minority voters. Now, when we saw that happens, she later recuses herself from that because, as she said in her evidence, in her commentary with Roland, that she did not want to have any improprieties, anything to look wrong here. She stepped back. Yet, again, Mr. Kemp continues to attack African-American voters in ways that seems prejudicial at best. Lastly, I would draw your attention and the black Republicans' attention and Republicans who call themselves people of good faith attention to a piece in the Washington Post by Paul Waldman, which says, no, we cannot guarantee that GOP are racist. We cannot guarantee that Republicans are racist. But you do have to ask yourself, how come racists feel really comfortable hanging out with the Republicans?
And if I can just push back on some of Ray's inaccuracies.
Brandon, I got one question.
Okay, yeah.
Brandon, I just have one question.
I got you.
Just have one question.
Yeah.
Have you asked for Shannon Wright, who's with who's also part of Republican Party there in Maryland, Eugene? Have you hit up the black members of the Republican National Committee committeemen? Have you hit up Kay James? Have you hit up J.C. Watts? Have you hit up Michael Steele? Have you hit up a group of black Republicans and say, hey, we as black Republicans should stand together as one and tell our party enough with the voter suppression, enough with the games and the tactics? Have you, I'm not asking somebody else, I'm asking Brandon, because I asked you this last year as well. Have you done that? And if you have, what's been the response?
And two things. One, you asked me this last year, and I told you, yes, I did actually put a tweet out. And I don't know if it was about the exact topic or about another topic.
No, I didn't say a tweet.
No, I mean a tweet I'm saying I've done it privately, but I also have an online record publicly that you can go look at where I tagged the individuals you just mentioned about coming together. I forget exactly what the topic was last year you asked me to do, but it was similar to this. And you can see the crickets that responded to it. But again, to that point, I think we disagree on the facts based of suppression.
Brandon, 1 second. Brandon, I'm going to let you make your other point.
Okay.
I just want to be clear.
Yes.
What you're saying is you privately have sent emails. Hold up. You privately have sent emails or text messages to a number of other black Republicans, including the people I mentioned, saying that we should come together to tell our party, stop suppressing the votes of people, especially people of color, and no one has responded to you. Is that what you're telling me?
No. Let me take it back again. I don't remember exactly what topic it was last year that I did it for, but again, we disagree on the premise of your statement, so of course I'm not going to do what you're asking me to do because we disagree on the whole premise that there is this coordinated effort.
So, Brandon, you disagree on the premise that Republicans are deliberately trying to suppress the vote.
Yes, that the blanket statement. Again, I don't like Chris Kobach. That's one person I don't dislike, so what's going on in Kansas is a case-by-case basis. But going back to Georgia, which I know you want to keep diverting from, you keep on going for Georgia. Okay.
So let me be clear.
Yes, sir.
Are you saying that the cross-check led by Chris Kobach is not voter suppression?
No, I'm saying I don't like Chris Kobach's activity. He's not. I disavow anything that Chris Kobach does. I go look in detail of it. But when you say Chris Kobach, my knee-jerk reaction is to reject what he does. I'm not a fan of Chris Kobach.
Are you saying that? What about when the North Carolina GOP was nailed by a federal judge for what federal judges saying they had a laser-like focus on targeting black voters? You disagree with that, or you agree with it?
No, I do not disagree. To an extent, they're trying to target Democrat voters, which obviously majority of them are black.
No.
It was based on Democrat.
No, Brandon. The federal judges in their statement said
I know that
was a laser-like focus on black voters.
I understand that.
They have emails of the North Carolina GOP specifically asking for data on when African Americans were voting in early voting.
And again, as I told you before, Roland, yes, when last year we brought this topic, I think actually was the North Carolina case that we talked about. I do not agree with that case-by-case effort. You want to keep diverting from Georgia, which I understand you do, because it's a flimsy case.
No.
I don't agree. You are, because no. I say it again, Roland. I disagree with that law that was passed by North Carolina. I disagree with you. Let me finish. I disagree with your statement that it was somehow.
Disagree with the trend of your party that continues to disenfranchise voters and suppress votes all across this country. Roland's point is that he could keep going. He could list Missouri, he could list North Carolina, he could list Florida, he could list Texas, he could list Louisiana, he could list Pennsylvania. We can keep going. The point is, you want to narrow this conversation to a singular state because that makes it easier to prove your point.
No, it's the state that we're talking about today.
That, however, is argumentatively fallacious.
Let me know when I can go.
Because at the end of the day, this is a trend that we see across the country and have seen for decades. And now, let me be clear, oppression and racism does not belong to a single party. I want to be very clear about that. However, voter suppression has continuously and consistently been pursued by the party that you belong to. So Roland's question is, are you willing to disavow that as much as you're willing to disavow Chris Kobach? And are you willing to actually stand up inside of your party and try to change that thing from the inside out? And I think that's a perfectly fair question.
Let me know when I can get back to my point. Let me know if I can get to my point.
The question, then you can get
I got my 5 questions I answered. I've answered 5 questions.
Brandon, 1 second. You can answer Brittany, and then you can make your final comment before I go on to my next story.
All right, 2 things. One, the reason I'm focused on Georgia, because that's what the whole setup was about. But if you want to talk about other states, we can talk about Maryland, where black voters are being disenfranchised, but not by the Republicans, but by Democrat Party leaders. We can talk about the NAACP stating as such, where they chop up black communities to put them into different districts to keep the Democrat hold. So that's an example. So you're right. It's not held by one party, but you want to talk about just the Republican Party. Talking about North Carolina, again, my point is this. I understand you want to make it into a narrative that you can use to gin up votes for your party, your favorite party. What I am saying is the effort in North Carolina, which I do not agree with, which if you brought on the National Committee woman from that state, she can speak to it more. I'm from Maryland, that's North Carolina. Their effort was to, again, unfairly, which I disagree with, attack the Democrat vote, which a large part of it is black voters. If black voters vote Republican, they will not be going after the black voters. So I want to make sure that's clear. It may be a nuance to you, but it's clear that it's a political game, which I do not agree with, but it was based on Democrat versus Republican and not the race baiting that you're trying to do. Lastly, I want to say on Georgia, which was the whole topic that you spent the first 20 minutes talking about, not a single voter in Georgia this coming election will be denied the right to vote. Not the 6.1 million who registered this year, a record number, or the 53,000 who were flagged because some of their information, whether the address, whether the social security number, or to your point, their name was not exactly the match. None of them will be denied the right to vote, go out and vote. And I agree that some of these hurdles to voting need to be fixed. But I also think it's an honest duty for you as a journalist to be honest with your viewers, not to be so much fear-mongering that someone is trying to deny the right to vote when no one in Georgia will be denied the right to vote this coming election.
Do you honestly believe some of the things you're saying, Brandon? And the reason why I asked, do you honestly believe these things are because
facts, but it's called facts. None of the 50,000 votes will be denied. That's a fact. They have 2 years.
The reason why I asked, do you believe these things, Brandon, very
mean that a vote won't be
it is less than 1% of the registered voters, which I agree is not insignificant, but it's less than 1% of registered voters have been flagged. A lot of them have been flagged in Democrat counties by Democrat Board of Elections in compliance with state law. And again, there's 2 years you have to provide the updated information so that it's a match. I don't agree with the exact match. There's a provision in Maryland that has exact matches, but the law in Georgia says exact match, and you have 2 years from the point of election to correct it.
So let me do this here. I'm going to read, first of all, let me see again. This is what happens, Brandon, which is shameful and despicable, is when you are unwilling to consider and deal with reality.
Okay.
On July 29th, 2016, now if I was in the office, I would say, Henry, go to my iPad. This is the story right here from the New York Times. Headline, Federal Appeals Court strikes down North Carolina voter ID requirement. This is the lead. A federal appeals court decisively struck down North Carolina's voter identification law on Friday, saying its provisions deliberately, quote, target African Americans with almost surgical precision, unquote, in an effort to depress black turnout at the polls. The sweeping 83-page decision by a panel of the United States Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit upended voting procedures in a battleground state about 3 months before Election Day. They go on to say in the ruling, these are federal judges, quote, the evidence in this case casts doubt on the notion that voter ID laws foster integrity and confidence. The Wisconsin experience demonstrates that a preoccupation with mostly phantom election fraud leads to real incidents of disenfranchisement, which undermine rather than enhance confidence in elections. They say in here that, yes, the state's significant, shameful past discrimination had largely abated in the last 25 years. But they wrote that there was a link, quote, a link between race and politics in North Carolina. Do not, Brandon, come on this show and dare say it's about Democrats or Republicans when the federal judges had evidence, emails of Republicans specifically asking, when do black voters vote during early elections?
And the intention
you
to
said
the
it wasn't about race.
I never said
it is completely about race.
Never said it was about race. I said they're using race to depress, like you said, the black vote and the Democrat vote. I agreed. I disavowed North Carolina. So again, you're trying to change my words or twist my words however you said it.
No, I didn't.
I said it last year.
1 second.
I'm saying it
I'm
now.
going to read
I
one more paragraph.
what North Carolina did last year. I'm not part of North Carolina GOP.
I'm going to read, Brandon, I'm going to read one more paragraph. This is from the federal judges. Quote, we cannot ignore the record evidence that because of race, the legislature enacted one of the largest restrictions of the franchise in modern North Carolina history. The court seems to do this.
I'm agreeing with you, Roland. We're agreeing on this issue.
But here's my point. Brandon, I asked you, have you and other black Republicans come out to publicly denounce the consistent voter suppression efforts of Republicans in multiple states, and you haven't answered?
I did answer it. I got to go back. And then let me say it again. I told you last year when you asked me to do this. I did it when it was called North Carolina. I don't know what it exactly was, but it was North Carolina. Go back to your tweets and find out. I
said it
privately. I did it publicly.
So
I did it privately. I did it publicly. The crickets,
as a group,
the crickets are out there. I'm saying it right now myself as well. I know you don't want me to say it, but I'm saying it. I disavow that. I said it last year.
Brandon, you have done that.
Okay,
Brandon,
thank you.
For the record,
I'll make sure that's
you
clear.
personally have disavowed that. But I'm specifically asking, why haven't Black Republicans as a group come together to publicly in a news conference denounce the party's consistent effort for voter suppression? And that, to me, is critically important. I got to go to a break. When we come back, we'll talk. Hold on one second. I got to go to a break. When we come back, we'll talk about this police officer who shot a young Black man in Philadelphia. Well, guess what? Charges have been actually reduced in that case, and we'll tell you what happened with the Michigan man who fired on a young Black man who was just trying to get some directions because a brother missed the school bus. You're watching Roland Martin Unfiltered, where we keep it real and unapologetic. Back in a moment.
Dear young people,
don't vote.
Don't vote.
Everything's fine the way it is.
Trump. That was us.
He's our guy.
Tax cuts for the rich? Hell yeah. I'm rich as
Climate change? That's a you problem. I'll be dead soon. Sure, school shootings are sad.
But I haven't been in a school for 50 years.
I can't keep track of which lives matter.
Sure you don't like it. So, you'll like some meme on Instagram.
If the weather is nice, maybe you could go to one of those little marches.
You might even share this video on Facebook.
But you won't vote.
You young people never do.
But I do. I do.
I do.
Midterms, primaries.
Every single election.
We'll be there, but you won't.
Because we're a generation of doers.
Not whiners.
And we're doing great.
I'm sure y'all, that's a hell of a video right there. A police officer who shot a young Black man in Philadelphia had his charges reduced from first-degree murder to third-degree murder. Now, in Chicago, the police board cleared another officer who shot a Black man in the back. But the cop who killed Tamir Rice isn't going to be getting that second chance job after all. In yet another white-on-black shooting, a 14-year-old boy stopped to ask for directions, and the white homeowner came out and tried to kill him with a shotgun. Folks, what is going on? All of these stories. First of all, the man, of course, was found guilty of assault with the intent to do great bodily harm. Talk about making no sense whatsoever, these cases. I'm just trying to understand what in the world is going on in the case, again, where you have these people who are losing their mind. Brittany, you got the guy in Michigan, the brother knocked on the door for directions. For directions. That's all. For directions. Brittany, go ahead.
Can you hear me? So
yeah, I can hear you now. Go ahead.
Yeah, you know exactly what's going on. Same thing happened when a young African-American man flagged someone down for directions in North Carolina and was killed. Blackness is far too often seen as a weapon in and of itself in this country. And so whether it's a police officer or a man who claims to be protecting his home, people feel that they have to stand their ground just when we show up in the place. So you know exactly what's happening. It happened to Trayvon Martin. It happened to Jordan Davis. It happened to Tamir Rice. It happened to Sandra Bland. It happened to Eric Garner. It happened to Michael Brown Jr. It happens over and over and over again. And, you know, a lot of people celebrated, understandably, the conviction of Officer Van Dyke in the killing of Laquan McDonald in Chicago just last week. But we have to remember that one case does not a pattern make. That was an anomaly, quite frankly. Less than 1% of officers who are ever even indicted for killing Black people are convicted of that crime. And so we have to actually do the work to not only hold people accountable, whether they are officers or citizens, for hurting and injuring and killing our people. We also have to make sure that we're doing the preventive work of stopping these things from happening in the first place.
I'm glad that Brittany brought up the case. I'm glad that, Roland, real quick, I'm glad that Brittany brought up the case of the young man who was stopped, Jonathan Farrell, the football player in North Carolina. And this incident happening outside of Michigan calls to mind Renisha McBride. And I think specifically about this idea about how time and time again, Black people are denied their humanity. And some of the viewers may hear that and think that we're being hyperbolic of some sort. But to merely knock on the door for directions because you're lost, or to knock on the door for help because you've been in a car crash, or to walk toward police who in some communities are your sign of safety and help after you've had an accident, but for Black people demands the calculated risk of, will this person interpret me as a threat and thus my life can be in their hands? time and time again, Black Americans are denied their humanity by white Americans. And we're coming to the point where, as Brittany pointed out in the celebration for the guilty verdict against Officer Jason Van Dyke, the mere acknowledgement of our humanity as communicated through justice in the United States criminal justice system is something worth celebrating for us. That's problematic. That's definitely terrible. And it's something that we will continue to take to the streets and beat to the walls of academics, beat to the walls of organizing, beat to the walls of our state legislatures until they realize, as our folks said back in the 1960s, simply put, I am a man or woman.
Yeah, I just want to
say. So here's the deal. The Chicago Police, hold on, Brandon, 1 second. The Chicago Police Board voted 5-3 this week to clear an officer of all wrongdoing for fatally shooting a young Black teen in the back of the head during a foot chase nearly 6 years ago. The shooting victim was Dakota Bright. He was 15 and unarmed. A year ago, Chicago's police watchdog agency took the rare step of finding the officer at fault for using excessive force and recommending he be fired. But the Chicago Police Board found the testimony of Officer Brandon Ternan, quote, credible and persuasive. The officer said he fired when he saw Dakota Bright turn towards him and reach into his pocket. No gun was found in his pocket, and the bullet that killed him hit him right in the middle of the back of his head. Not at all consistent with someone turning around. By the way, Officer Brandon Ternan was the subject of at least 3 lawsuits alleging police misconduct, which have already cost the city of Chicago over $1 million to settle. Now, in the case of Philadelphia, an officer arrested in the fatal shooting of a Black man last year posted bail Thursday and got out of jail after a judge granted bail and reduced the charges. Now, the judge reduced the former officer's charge from first-degree murder to third-degree murder, saying the grand jury did not find enough evidence to support the higher charge. The victim, David Jones, was running away from the officer when he shot him in the back. This is the second time this officer shot someone in the back. The city of Philadelphia has paid the victim's family $1 million in a settlement. Jones' grandmother, Donna Clement Jackson, said, quote, we know God's delay is not a denial. We stand fast. We know justice will be done. No matter what the charges are, we know he is guilty. And also, we told you about Timothy Loman, the cop who shot and killed Tamir Rice. He almost had a new job. He was hired as a part-time police officer in Bel Air, Ohio. But Samaria Rice, Tamir's mother, was not having it. She threatened protests and launched a social media campaign with Black Lives Matter in Cleveland, calling on people to raise hell with the mayor and the Bel Air Police Department. Guess what? The coward Loman withdrew his application. The power of protest, folks, works. Brandon, go ahead.
No, I was going to echo what my panelists, Brittany and Ray, were talking about as far as the value of Black life not being insignificant compared to white in this country. There's plenty of examples of it. I think the advent of social media puts it right in our face. Corey Lewis from Georgia, we saw a video this week of him babysitting 2 white girls and gets the police called on him because they feel as if the lives of those white girls are somehow in danger because of a Black babysitter. So I think we've all said it. It's prevalent, whether it's in the police department, whether it's police acting, private citizens acting, all across this country. It's something that's been in the stain of our country for a long time, and it has not, at this point, been solved.
And I mentioned, folks, Brennan Walker, the 14-year-old young Black guy, man from Rochester High School in Detroit. 6 months ago, he knocked on Jeffrey Ziegler's door asking for directions after he missed the school bus. Well, Ziegler comes out with his shotgun. You see the video right here, and fired at him. And then, of course, at first, Ziegler said he tripped and the shotgun went off by mistake. Well, you can see he lied by the videotape. When the cops saw the tape, they knew he was lying. Ziegler's trial on charges of attempted murder went to the jury this morning, and this afternoon, they found him guilty of assault with intent to do great bodily harm. His bail was revoked, and sentencing is scheduled for November 18th. We'll certainly let you know how many years he is going to get in prison. Brittany, again, people say, folks like you and others, oh, you're making a big deal out of this. Cops shooting folks in the back of the head, in the back, and then lying about it, saying, oh, they were turning towards me.
Yeah. My humanity is always a big deal, just like your humanity is always a big deal to me. The way that we treat each other and the fact that people should be able to walk, live freely and authentically with joy and love in their hearts, that should be a big deal to all of us. Those are the ideals of this country. And, you know, you went through the amount that cities pay out, and let's be clear that taxpayers pay out in order to actually fulfill these civil requirements after families of victims sue cities and police departments departments and individual officers, it certainly doesn't make financial sense to continue for this to happen. It certainly doesn't make moral sense for this to continue to happen. The only kind of sense that it makes is if you are trying to maintain a particular kind of social order. We have to recognize that the foundation of police departments in this country was actually not at all about serving and protecting citizens. It was about protecting property. And when police forces were created, what was that property? It was black people, enslaved Africans all across the South and the colonies, who were responsible for creating this economy in this country as we know it on the land of indigenous people. And so at the end of the day, we have to recognize that the forces that were designed to operate this way are operating exactly as they are. That's why it's important that people like Lucy McBath, who's Jordan Davis's mother, who is a victim of a vigilante, that she is running for Congress. It's important that people like Stacey Abrams and Andrew Gillum, who have made issues of gun violence, not just as they affect white communities, but also as they affect communities of color, part of their political platforms. It's high time that we actually see the kind of work that protesters have been demanding all across this country make room in the halls of power and actually change things on the policy level.
Folks, we're going to go to a break right now. Time for our HBCU Giving Day School. Roll it, please. All right, folks, Jackson State University is our HBCU Giving Day School. You can go to their website, jsums.edu. They're doing some amazing things there. Of course, they are one of the largest HBCUs in the United States, the fourth largest university in Mississippi, and home of the Sonic Boom of the South, a marching band founded in 1940. So please support Jackson State, jsums.edu. And if you are a graduate, I fully expect you to give back a check because we've got to support our institutions. Folks, one of the reasons we created this show, not only to speak to our issues, but to provide an opportunity for folks like Ray and Brandon and Brittany to be able to speak to these concerns as well, is because we need to be able to tell our own story. Well, the black press has always been at the forefront of telling our own story, of course, played a huge role in World War I, World War II, of course, the Civil Rights Movement. And you know, the first black newspaper was founded in 1827. The first editors were John Russwurm and Samuel Cornish, free-born African Americans. Again, the first editors of Freedom Journal, the first black-owned and operated newspaper, which was launched in March of 1827. South Carolina journalist John McCrae and his allies at the Lighthouse and Informer challenged their readers to rebel and fight. Folks, Newspaper Wars is a book that chronicles the role journalism played in the fight for civil rights in South Carolina. And the author, Sid Bedingfield, joins us right now. Sid, glad to have you on Roland Martin Unfiltered. And one of the reasons why I thought it was important to have you here talking, how? Do we have Sid? All right,
yeah, I hope so.
Got it. We got you. So, Sid, one of the reasons I wanted to have you here to talk about this book, because what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to connect this generation with the black press historically and why we have to have black media outlets like this one that tell our story, where many of these stories often don't get the level of intensity from mainstream cable and broadcast news or even a lot of our major newspapers.
Well, I think that's true. One thing I wanted to do in the book was to give due credit to John Henry McCrae and the Lighthouse and Informer. Sometimes in the study, even within the study of the black press, the African-American press, the Southern black press of the first half of the 20th century, it's sometimes disregarded. It's seen as always being cautious, conservative, accommodationist, unwilling to push for civil rights forcefully, understandably, under the oppression of Jim Crow rule at that time. But John Henry McCrae stepped out of that model. He launched his paper actually in Charleston, was aggressive in fighting for equal rights for African Americans, from demanding it. And he in his paper played a sort of an unheralded role in launching a very successful civil rights effort in South Carolina in the late 30s and particularly in the 40s. The movement flourished in the 40s, had some real success in the 40s and early 50s, and then was sort of fractured and dispersed by fierce white backlash, especially in the years after Brown v. Board of Education. But John McCrae, I think, is a hero who doesn't get enough credit. Is one of those black editors in the Deep South, not just the South, but in the Deep South, who actually helped launch the civil rights movement there.
You know, Brittany, it's very interesting, and I want you to ask a question of Sid as well here. I look at present day when I see a lot of these stories and these things crop up, and then I'll watch these documentaries and I'll see these folks from mainstream media talking about these issues, and I'm going, y'all know many of us who are in black media started these movements, got these things going. I mean, matter of fact, look, it was even a trip watching the Trayvon Martin documentary that Jay-Z was involved with, and I'm sitting here looking at people, I'm going, that's not what happened. I know the black people who were driving this thing on social media. Yeah. So it's very interesting, like even present day, how those of us in black media get ignored when we actually launch a lot of these major stories. Go ahead with your question, Brittany.
Well, you know, we have an oral tradition, right? We are storytellers dating all the way back to our ancestors. And so it is not a novel idea whatsoever that we would be at the forefront of telling the most important stories of the day. You know, Sid, my first internship in college was actually at the St. Louis American, which is our leading black paper in my hometown. And it's an institution that I continue to work with and that I'm deeply proud of. And I would love for folks to know, whether they are black or not black, how they can support black newspapers, black media outlets, and ensure that our stories are heard.
Well, I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer how they can support it now, although certainly reading it, we've seen a resurgence of African-American media online, right? The Root, Rio, and other things as well. There is a kind of a story in the historiography of the black press that says, you know, in the 60s, when the white press began to at least marginally cover the African-American community to some extent, cover civil rights to some extent, that the black press, quote, died, or at least withered away significantly. But the fact is it didn't wither away. And we're actually seeing a resurgence now. So there are a lot of places now where at the African-American press, I think, thrives in a way that it hasn't in the past 20 or 30 years.
Ray?
Sid, this is Ray Baker. I'm interested in something that you mentioned, particularly the question of black journalists in the Deep South and how you noted the delineation there. Many of the viewers may be well familiar with Ida B. Wells and how she risked her life to tell stories about lynching. But can you tell our viewers about some more of the freedom fighters who were journalists, who risked their lives, not just in their reporting, but in putting themselves on the front line of stories that some of the white press weren't covering?
Absolutely. John Henry McCrae is a great example in South Carolina. Another man, Lewis Austin, the Carolina Times in North Carolina, a little bit older than McCrae, not much though. Launched his paper in the early 30s, actually in 1927. Took over a paper there, started running it, and again, like John Henry McCrae, he was an aggressive proponent for equality at a time when lynchings were prevalent, when the danger was great, when law enforcement was not essentially there present for African Americans. Some would say that's still the case at times now, but certainly then it was common. These guys were out there telling stories that were angering the status quo, the Jim Crow rule in those areas. Lewis Austin certainly in South Carolina, in North Carolina. One thing about in Atlanta, you have the Scott family, which ran the Atlanta World, which became the Atlanta Daily World in the 30s. One of the largest African-American papers in the nation, certainly did its part to raise issues, but it was really a much more conservative paper than the Lighthouse Informer in South Carolina or Lewis Austin's Carolina Times in North Carolina. C.A. Scott, the Scott family, they were sort of, as today, Atlanta had a large African-American middle class, burgeoning middle class at that time. The Scott family was not really willing to sort of push the issues to the point of confrontation. They always wanted to negotiate, despite the existence of segregation and second-class status in Atlanta at that time. So that idea that Southern African-American newspapers, Deep South African-American newspapers were conservative, caution, and even accommodationist at that period really does sort of come from that reputation that the Atlanta Daily World had. Atlanta Daily World was not sure that it really wanted to support, for example, Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund's effort to pursue the Brown case all the way. They were adamant proponents of equal pay for black teachers in the South at that time. But they really did not want to get rid of the dual educational system. And you had, I think it's no surprise, public opinion in the African-American community was not monolithic at that time. And so you had these newspapers sort of fighting out the battles within the community about what strategy should we take going forward. And the Scott family took a much more cautious and conservative approach. But you did have people like John Henry McCrae and others who wanted to go in a different direction, wanted to actually push for full equality. And eventually they got it, but they paid a price too. I can tell you some stories about
Brandon,
how the
real
price
quick. What's your question, Brandon, real quick?
Paid as well.
Well, no, I just like your point about not monolithic and the different viewpoints in the black community. But the only point I'll ask is now, fast forward to today in the age of Trump, and what issues do you think currently going on would be covered differently if the black press, had more of a voice, I guess, competing against the white mainstream media that sometimes cover the issues? What kind of issues today do you think would be covered differently or not being covered enough by the mainstream white press?
Oh, I think
like about 30 seconds, Sid. Go ahead.
Okay, police. I would go with police treatment of African Americans. I think immigration, which also resonates with the African American community as well, would be treated different. I think there would be a lot of issues that would have more sustained, what I'm old school here, front page coverage would get a lot of more attention than maybe they get from the mainstream press. They wouldn't let up as much as the mainstream press does in trying to be very even-handed on some of these issues where Trump is frankly trying to generate racial resentment as a way to gain political leverage. I think they would be much more out front in making that an actual political issue.
And you're absolutely correct, which is why we speak truth to power right here on Roland Martin Unfiltered. Sid, I certainly appreciate it. Thank you so very much. Again, folks, pull the graphic up of the book. It is called Newspaper Wars, Civil Rights and White Resistance in South Carolina, 1935 to 1965 by Sid Bedingfield. Thank you so very much, Sid. Folks, don't forget, you can support Roland Martin Unfiltered by joining our Bring the Funk fan club. Please go to RolandMartinUnfiltered.com to do so. Let me thank Brittany Packnett, as well as Brandon Cooper and Ray Baker for joining me today on the panel. Folks, I've got to go. They're waiting for me downstairs. I'm here in Bloomington, Illinois, to speak at the Freedom Fund dinner for the NAACP chapter here. And so hopefully when I go down there, hopefully the Wi-Fi is pretty good so I can live stream the speech and you can all check it out. For all of the folks back in the office, thank you so very much for joining us. I shall see you guys Monday from Washington, D.C., right here on Roland Martin Unfiltered. Don't forget, you can go to our YouTube channel. Please subscribe to it. We're almost at 200,000 subscribers. We want to hit that number, and you can watch the previous shows plus clips, and you can watch all that as well. And we'll be restreaming today's show multiple times over the next 24 hours. Y'all take care. Also, by the way, St. Jude, Celebration of Hope. I'll see you guys tomorrow in Memphis. Holla!